You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Where I met, my name's Scott, one of the pastors here as well, and as you may have, if you've been here a amount of time, you just see the Lord continues to bless us. The bench of leadership around here just keeps getting deeper and deeper, and we believe that's not just so that we can enjoy it, but so that, because God has a purpose for what he is doing in our body and beyond it as we multiply and spread out, and as he takes the church and multiplies it to all the ends of the earth, and that's as I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about how he's multiplying leaders and multiplying shepherds and multiplying pastors. I've been thinking a lot this week after we talked at our elder meeting with the guys that are going down to the church plant in the South Bay. And we just encourage you to continue to be praying for them. We're going to get an update from them, a little update video in the next couple of weeks. But just another picture of what God's doing and why we see him continually multiplying new believers, multiplying new leaders, multiplying pastors. And we feel like that's not just for the sake of a kind of micro kingdom here in West LA, but continually for the sake of the gospel throughout our city and throughout the world. And just ask you to continue to pray for that broadly and specifically for the South Bay as well as the Lord continues to work there. As we began our walk through the New Testament book of James a few weeks ago, James, in his letter, jumps right into the topic of suffering, right? And you've probably picked up on this as our sermons kind of jumped right into the topic of suffering, right? The second verse of the entire letter, after his introduction and who he is and who he's writing to, the very first thing he says is, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And as we've seen over the past few weeks, this theme has been really over the entire beginning of the chapter, and in some ways it continues throughout the whole book, but especially through these sections. And we've looked at the joy that we're called to have in the midst of suffering. We've looked at how when we put on the glasses of wisdom, we're able to see suffering for what it actually is and experience the joy in the midst of that. And last week we looked at an example of suffering, this lowliness that James talks about, and how it looks different when we see it through those same glasses of wisdom, and then really the glasses of eternity. And in our passage today, James shows us what happens when we put the glasses of wisdom on and not only look at the world, but also look at ourselves in the midst of the world. Because sometimes the trials we experience come in the form of living in a fallen world, but sometimes and oftentimes, if not all the time, they're experienced also as people with fallen hearts. And inevitably, whenever we experience trials in the fallen world, temptations seem to follow right behind them, right? I mean, is this just my experience, right? I mean, I assume it's probably yours too, right? Whenever things are hard, it seems like temptation comes with it, as if the hard things cause the temptation, right? I mean, just think about the last time you sinned, like knowingly, right? And some of you are like, I don't know, it's kind of hard. I guess I'll try to, right? Most of you, if you're honest with yourself, you're probably thinking about something that happened this morning, right? I mean, it's 10:30. I'm not sure if you've gotten this far without it, right? When was the last time you knowingly spoke unlovingly to someone, right? That you can identify when you lied or told a half-truth or just kind of glossed the truth, or when you took something that wasn't yours, borrowed it, right? That wasn't yours. Right? When you lusted after someone, or when you lusted after something, when you coveted a car or a house or an outfit or a job or an award or a lifestyle that God gave to someone else but hasn't given to you. Right? I took a moment, was like jotting down. I'm like, this is helpful for me. I'm like, I'm sure I've sinned. I'm like, okay, well, no, let me write down the times where I know either sinful thoughts or sinful actions or sinful words. And by sinful, again, I don't mean you said the worst thing you could imagine, but really anything that was a manifestation of yourself, serving yourself instead of loving and caring for others, instead of honoring the Lord. And I think when we think about what those were, whether it was this morning, whether it was last night, whether it was sometime yesterday, if you got to go further back than that, you need to be a little more honest with yourself. But whenever it was, I think it begs the question, why did that happen? Right? Why did I think that? Why did I feel that? Why did I say that? Why did I do that? Or at the very least, what tempted me to do that? Now, chances are it probably took place in the context of some type of trial, some type of difficulty, whether it's big or little, some type of suffering. And our tendency is to look at all the external aspects of our trials and to look at them and say, that's what caused my temptation, right? What caused my temptation was how someone treated me, right? How they treated me caused me to speak unloving to them. Being put on the spot caused me to not tell the truth. Our sense of injustice or economic disparities caused us to take what was not technically ours, right? The way someone else dressed caused you to lust. The way someone else lived caused you to covet. Or even in a more indirect way, like, well, it was I didn't get enough sleep, or I didn't eat the right things, or there was stress at work. And while all of these situations may very well be the occasion of our temptation, we can't confuse the occasion of temptation for the cause of it. Because while any of these situations could definitely supercharge our temptation, while it definitely could make our temptation more difficult, none of them could be its ultimate cause. The ultimate causes of our enticements to sin don't come from outside of us. They don't come from these external situations, and they don't come from God. But temptation at its core is born in the depths of our hearts, as we learn from our passage today. We're going to look at James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15, but we're going to start with verses 13 to 15. We'll come back to 12 in a while. Starting in verse 13, he says this, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death." Uplifting passage, right? Our passage today begins actually by clarifying where temptation does not come from, right? The context or the testing here that he talks about is important to understand. He says, this does not, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God himself can't be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And this idea of temptation comes from the idea of testing, what Scripture calls, and actually maybe in the verse before, and translated in the verse before, testing. And the biblical analogy that we find repeatedly is one of precious metals that are purified in order to bring the pure metals out, right? If you dig out a rock that contains gold in it, chances are it's not going to be a just gigantic nugget of pure gold, right? Unless you live in a cartoon or something, right? It's mixed up with all sorts of other kinds of rock, all kinds of stone, all kinds of impurities. And in order to get the pure gold out of the rock, you have to heat it up in order for the impurities and the pure gold to be separated. And this process of heating, this process of separating is called testing. And it's really what I think he had in mind here. But the testing, heating it up and testing it, didn't put the impurities in the rock. It just drew them out, right? I mean, in a similar way, and maybe an easier way, more familiar way for us to think about it, it's like a math test, right? Some of you took math tests last week. Some of you, it's been years. But you've probably taken a math test. And when a teacher gives a math test, the student will either pass or fail based on the knowledge of the subject, right? The student is responsible for learning and retaining the information. And failure on the test is caused by the student not studying sufficiently. the cause of the failure isn't that the teacher gave the test, right? Excuse me. And I mean, I'm sure there have been a number of students who have tried this, right? Like, I wouldn't have failed if you hadn't given me the test. But it falls away, right? Taking the test is simply an opportunity to demonstrate, your knowledge of a subject. And failure on it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the test, it means there's something wrong with my knowledge. And in a similar way, God allows and sometimes even brings trials into our lives, and he redeems our trials. He redeems the things that he allows by using them to make us more like him and to give us an opportunity to demonstrate the reality of our faith and the reality of who we are inside. But just because in the midst of the pressure, in the midst of the trial, we are tempted to sin, doesn't mean that we are enticed to sin because it's God who entices us. If we're enticed to sin as a result of our trials, the cause of that enticement comes from somewhere else. And I mean, we probably know better than to just say, God tempts me to sin, right? And we're like, oh, okay, I know the Bible probably says somewhere, this is where, that God doesn't tempt us to sin, right? And so you're like, I probably kind of learned that somewhere, so we don't say it like that, but we intimate it in more subtle ways, right? We ask questions like, why is this so hard? Why doesn't God just take this away? Why doesn't he just make it easier? Why do I have to endure this? Well, why is he letting me go through this? Why is he making me go through this? Why is he testing me? And when we experience trials and are tempted to sin, either internally and sin either internally or sin externally as a result, we often tend to subtly question God's character as the one who is ultimately responsible. But it's into this, not only the clear claims of God tempting us, but it's even into these subtle questions that James reminds us that God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. He gives us the glasses of wisdom to put on as we look at the reality of our experience, of our temptation and the enticement to sin. And through those glasses, we can see clearly where our experience of temptation actually comes from. And he says this in verse 14, he goes on, but each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. I think the translation of this word lured is an excellent translation. It's because it carries with it, even the original, this idea of fishing. It carries with it a picture of fishing and being carried along, being drawn along by a lure, right? Like a fish that's just kind of following along a lure. For those of you who've actually been fishing before. Some of you love fishing, right? And you can watch, if it's clear water, you can watch the fish just like follow along, and until it strikes. Right, and takes the bait and the hook with it. But it's this same imagery of being lured along, or being drawn along, or being invited in that Proverbs uses when it personifies foolishness. It personifies foolishness as opposed to wisdom, which is kind of the opposite of wisdom, foolishness being the opposite of wisdom. It personifies it as a temptress. And says foolishness is like a temptress. We give this picture in Proverbs chapter 7. He says, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, at every corner she lies in wait. And she seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face says to him, come, let us take fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. And with much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him, right? The same lured along. All at once, he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter. Which I think begs the question, what is the baited hook? what is the temptress? Like, what is it that he's talking? Because, again, this is a personification. This isn't meant to, like, say, hey, look out, because in every market, in every square, in every corner you walk around, there's going to be a woman dressed as a prostitute who's going to try to grab you, right? It might happen, but probably not, right? And that's not the point. The point isn't like, hey, look out for that. The point is, we're lured and enticed like that by all sorts of things. Not just sex. I mean, sex is one of them, but all sorts of things, all sorts of desires, all sorts of wants. It says we are lured and enticed and drawn on and begged in, and we follow the enticement over and over. And it begs the question, what is on the hook then? What is so tempting? What are the words that the temptress says? What lures us in? What entices us to sin? What makes the abandonment of God and his design make so much sense to us in a certain moment? And the answer is, James says, it's your desires that are at war within you. You have baited your own hook. You have led yourself astray. The source of your enticement to sin is your own desire. And this is fascinating. It demonstrates that the source of our temptation is, in fact, our own self-interest, our own self-worship that morphs into different things at different moments. Basically, whatever we think will get us what we want, what we desire. It's slightly like, you'll have to forgive me, this is what I'm reading with my kids right now, but it's slightly like a boggart from the Harry Potter books. And some of you are like, oh, yeah. And others of you are like, I have no idea what that is. That's okay, I'll explain it to you. A boggart is a shapeshifter. A boggart is a shapeshifter that takes the form of the greatest fear of whoever's standing in front of it. So whatever is standing in front of it, it's this like magical creature that shapeshifts into whatever you fear the most. And it's fascinating. It's actually a fascinating literary device because it like helps you learn a lot about characters through their engagement with a boggart. But the thing about in the story, the thing that students need to learn is that a boggart is actually not to be feared. Because it's not really the thing you fear most. It's just a creature. Right? It takes the form of what you fear most, but it's not actually worthy of your fear. And in a similar way, our temptations are shapeshifters. They take the form of whatever we desire most in any given moment. And this is why your desires change from moment to moment. This is why you just strongly desire one thing in the morning and something totally different at night. And your temptations glom onto whatever in any given moment you think is going to give you what you ultimately desire. But the problem is, none of the things you are tempted to desire, none of the things you are tempted to grab onto, none of them are real. Just like the boggart isn't actually worthy of ultimate fear, what you're being tempted by isn't actually worthy of your ultimate desire. It can't deliver what you actually ultimately desire. And then now the problem isn't that we have desires, right? We all have desires, and that's a good thing. It's a God-given thing. But when our greatest desire is something, really, when our greatest desire is anything other than God himself, that's when we're led astray. When that's the case, whatever I desire disproportionately. I'll never be satisfied. I will never be content. And I'm led over and over and over into sinful, into self-focused emotions and thoughts and behaviors. Right? As we've said before, the problem isn't wanting bad things, it's wanting things too badly. The cause of our temptations is our over-desires. The Old Testament calls this kind of over-desire, this kind of self-focus, it calls it idolatry. And the New Testament calls it desire, the same ruling passion This over-desire that the Old Testament calls idolatry, the New Testament repeatedly calls our passions or our desires. And as you go through the New Testament, we see this over and over. In 1 Peter 2, he says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and aliens and exiles to abstain from the passions, the desires of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." 1 John 2, "The world is passing away with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." James 4, later on in this book, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, your passions, your desires, they're at war within you?" And see, the problem is we always speak, act, think, and feel in light of our greatest desires. And so when our greatest desire is God, we speak, act, think, and feel in ways that honor God. But when our greatest desire in any given moment is anything other than God, we are wrecked by discontentment. And we are tempted over and over and over to sin. Jonathan Edwards actually defines this as what it means to have free will. He taught that the very nature of free will is that we only do what we desire most to do in any given moment. He said, we all of us, every single one of us, only ever does whatever we want to do the most in any given moment. So whatever you desire most, that's what you do. The problem isn't that you do things you don't desire. The problem is that in any given moment, my desires can be for something, the ultimate desire in my heart can be for something that serves me, not something that glorifies God. Therefore, when we sin, it's because our greatest desire at that moment is something other than God, right? You tell a half-truth because you desire to keep your job more than you desire to honor God by not lying. In that moment, your desire shape-shifts into keeping your job, and you serve whatever you desire. You look at an inappropriate website because you desire the momentary thrill you'll get more than you desire to avoid the pain it causes, or more than you desire to honor the Lord. In that moment, your desire shape-shifts into a momentary thrill, and you serve whatever you desire, which ultimately undercuts really most of the excuses we try to throw out in the wake of our moral failures, right? When we do sin, when we do fall, we can't ever say that we didn't want to sin. The reality is we did. In that moment, we wanted that more than anything else. We can't ever say we had to sin. In that moment, we chose to act on our greatest desire, which is both freeing and humbling. It means that we're not, in fact, a slave to our sin. If our desires can change, then our choices can change. It also means, though, that we can't shift the blame for our failures to anywhere outside of ourselves. It's not anyone else's fault. It's not God's fault. We were tempted, we sinned because we were lured and enticed by our own desire. A desire that in that moment we desired more than to please or to honor God. So here's the bottom line, right? The bottom line is we are all responsible for our own temptations. We are our own enticements to sin. Every trial, as I said, every trial comes with temptations. It seems to carry temptations in with it, but every difficulty carries in with it an opportunity to serve yourself. But the trial itself is not the temptation. It's not your boss. It's not your kids. It's not your roommates. It's not your spouse. It's not your parents. It's not your workload. It's not your life stage. It's not your sleep schedule. Those all may be occasions of the temptation, but they are not the ultimate cause. The cause is our over desires. And when we make choices based on our over desires, when we make choices out of our over desires, there's only one place those choices lead. He tells us in verse 15, then desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. You may have heard this before. This may be a familiar concept, but I think the problem for me is when I write down the ways that I've been struggling, the ways that I've been discontent, the ways that I've been tempted, the ways that I've sinned, even in the last week, they all look pretty justifiable. And they all look like something that I can connect the dots to the trial that led to them. And they all just provide something that makes me, an understanding that makes me just want to slip out from the responsibility of them. But not only that, none of them look like they're actually going to lead to death. Right? To the extent that I believed that this was empty and the result was death and there was just like this was a hopeless pursuit, it wouldn't be tempting. Right? It wouldn't be compelling if I was like, no, that really leads to death. When I look at the list, I'm like, Matt, I'm not sure I see how those all lead to death. I feel like if I got those, I'd be pretty happy. I mean, some of them may be obvious. Some of them may be but some of our over-desires just seem to make sense to our fallen hearts. But as Tim Keller puts it, when you love anything more than God, it is always a fatal attraction. And this is, even if we know those things, this is the reminder that you and I desperately need this morning. That the things that don't look like they lead to death, the things that seem reasonable, the things that look like they were caused by the outside world are actually caused by our own desires, are actually our responsibility, and truly do lead to death. See, just like every other idol that's ever been worshipped, right? Following the lead of any created thing only leads to pain and hurt and frustration and confusion. And we don't have and I think we see this more clearly, right, when we think about actual physical idols, right? If you're hey, yeah, if I created a statue and asked for its direction, that would probably lead to death. But the same is true for the idols in our hearts, right? I mean, the closest thing I've seen to an idol is this. This is a Jesus bobblehead. It's been on my desk. I actually don't even know where it came from, but it's been on my desk for a few months. And I've been hanging on to it because I'm at some point I've got to use this for a sermon illustration, so then I can throw it away because I feel a little awkward even having it. Right? I mean, doesn't it feel a little heretical just looking at it? But anyways, I'm not hating on it. It just makes me feel awkward, I'll be honest with you. But what if I made all the choices in my life based on the guidance? I just asked my bobblehead, right? What should I do? What should I do, Jesus bobblehead, right? Should I go out to dinner tonight, right? Should I cheat on my taxes? Should I cheat on my wife, right? Should I, lie about this, right? Any different choice. If I left it up to the bobblehead, I mean, first of all, it'd be confusing because I can never quite understand if he's saying yes or no. But it's actually that makes this a perfect example. You can never quite tell if he's saying yes or no, and so he kind of looks like he's saying what you want him to say, which is what idols do. And I think you can understand that if I let this bobblehead determine the decisions for my life, there's pretty much no chance that does not end poorly, right? It's going to end in destruction. It's going to end in broken relationships. It's going to end in foolishness and sin. And that's what we're doing every time we follow our desires into our choices. That is what God is saying it looks like to listen to our desires, because that's where it leads. When the desire to get the next promotion tells me I need to neglect my family, when the desire to be respected tells me I need to put on this false story, when the desire to relax tells me I need to yell at my kids or curse at my roommate, when the desire to love when my desire for love tells me I need to take it from my husband, or the desire for respect tells me I have to demand it from my wife, it doesn't end well. It never ends well, and it never has ended well. Like, this is a story that's been on loop and repeat for literally millennia. And here James is saying, just remember, like, it's not like this sometimes works out. It always leads to death. James's progressive logic here is actually fascinating because he's writing to the 12 tribes that are dispersed. He's writing to Jewish Christians who I am sure, when they hear these things, have this proverbial temptress in their heads, right? The antithesis of wisdom. This is what they're picturing. And he's kind of taking this life that is following the lead of this temptress. He's taking it to its logical conclusion, and he continues kind of the sexual metaphor, essentially. He says, when you follow the temptress of your desires, when you allow your desire to become your over-desire, in any given moment, your greatest desire, when you give yourself wholly to the things you desire, and like it's like giving yourself wholly to the temptress. And this act of giving yourself wholly to your desire, it conceives. And it conceives sin. And that what is conceived gets born. And what is conceived is born and grows up. And when what is conceived is born and grows up, it grows up and it kills you. That's the story. That's how this turns out. It either does it moment to moment in practical ways, and as we see the foolishness of our following the world, we can see death, we can see the fingerprints of death as things just fall apart in our hands. But it also falls apart ultimately. When we follow this path, he says that there is nothing but even eternal death when we forsake the one true God. This is why James later on in chapter 4 writes, he's writing to people in this, he says, you adulterous people. He continues this kind of analogy, right? You've forsaken, you've committed spiritual adultery against your God. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? It's being an enemy of God. He says, therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And I don't know about you, but when I hear that, when I read that my temptations are not brought by God, when they are not the cause of the things outside, but they are my own responsibility, and that every time I am tempted and lured, it is because of the desires that are at war within me, and the desires that are at war within me give birth to sin and come back and kill me. It sounds hopeless, right? You're like, that. What do I do? Which means I think it's time to jump back to verse 12. Because in the context of both James and in the context of the New Testament, he tells us that while this is the true economy of the world, God has given us hope. He writes in verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. It's a fascinating parallel to the, right? We just looked at temptation when indulged leads to sin, and sin when lived out leads to death. And here he says, trial when endured leads to steadfastness, and steadfastness leads to the crown of life. There's these parallel pictures. He says, look, there's two roads here. So what's the difference? How do we get onto that road, right? What does that road look like? How do we endure instead of indulge? How do we experience steadfastness instead of sin? How do we experience the result of life instead of death? And I think all the pieces, actually, all the kind of signposts are here in verse 12. And we just need to take it apart and look at it and look at what he's pointing to. But we're going to do so by actually, I think, tracing we are going to do this because I'm in control of this moment right now. We're going to trace this backwards we're going to trace verse 12 backwards from the end to the beginning. And verse 12 ends talking about how this promise, what he's talking about refers to and is for those who love him. Those who love him. So, who are those who love him? Who is he talking about? Well, as we read in 1 John, we love because he first loved us. Those who love him are those who have been transformed by the love he has shown us. Those who God loves, or those who love God are those who have learned about his magnificent love and accepted his grace. Those who've received his forgiveness, who's responded to his good news, and therefore been made spiritually alive by the power of his Spirit. Ephesians 2 speaks exactly to this kind of death and life that we're talking about here. At the beginning it says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And then in verse 4 it says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you've been saved. And that is the message of the gospel. That for those who are headed towards death, the path to life is filled with grace. And it is all grace. God, in all of his wonder and his majesty and his righteousness and his justice and his power and his glory, looked on his creation and loved us. He's so overwhelmingly rich in mercy that his mercy just overflowed to us. And even though we sin, even though we're constantly tempted, even though left to ourselves we would just chase after our own desires, even though without him we are spiritually dead, through Christ, through faith in Christ, he has made us alive and has caused us to be born again. And if that's not something you've ever known before, if you're visiting here, somebody's just invited you, just kind of checking things out here, all it takes is faith. God's not asking you to clean yourself up first. He's not asking you to get everything right. He's not asking you to kind of straighten up life first and then come to him. He's not asking you to earn anything. He's offering you life and grace and forgiveness and an everlasting relationship with him, free simply by his grace through faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And all he's asking is for us to accept it. And when we accept it, when we remember the truth of it, when we remember the truth of the magnitude and glory and beauty of God's grace, we begin to see the world through the eyes of wisdom. We begin to see it clearly, and everything looks different because when we have been loved that immensely, it cannot help but shape and impact our greatest desires. The Puritan Thomas Chalmers, he put it this way. He said, the most effectual way of withdrawing the mind from one object is not by turning it away upon desolate or unpeopled vacancy, but by presenting to its regard another object still more alluring. Here's what he's saying. In other words, he says the one way, the only way to break the hold of a beautiful object on the soul is to show it an object that's more beautiful. He's saying you can't change your desires by trying to stop desiring it. You can't just say, oh, you know what? I am desiring the wrong things, or I'm desiring things too much. I should desire them less. It's true, but you can't just do that. You also can't stop desiring something by trying to point out its flaws. You ever try to do this? Right? You're like, oh, I really covet that house. Okay, let me think about all the things that are bad about it. And maybe that'll make me stop wanting it as much. It doesn't work, right? That doesn't happen. The only way to break the hold that something beautiful has on your soul is to catch a glimpse of something more beautiful. And when God is the ultimately most beautiful, when he is the most glorious, then when all we need to do is what God is calling us to do constantly is to take our eyes off this world, to remember what he has done, to remember who he is in his glory and his beauty and his majesty. And when we do, every other desire in the world looks like that. It's tiny, and it's silly, and it's powerless to deliver the beauty and the majesty that the one true God of the world can. This is the glorious gospel. Our career trajectory, our health or success of our kids, our experience or physical pleasure, our dream relationships, our dream houses or apartments or cities or contexts, they're all good things, but they're puny idols. They can't actually deliver what you're looking for them to deliver, especially when compared to the God of the universe, and especially when we remember what God has promised to those who've been transformed by his love. And while there's all sorts of different things we could look at that God has promised, the most ultimate that he mentions here in this passage, he says, is the crown of life. Now, when you picture a crown, I imagine, and if you're anything like me, I imagine you picture a gigantic gold, shiny thing with lots of rubies and stones in it, and it's almost like the more glorious, the bigger the crown, the harder it is to keep on your head and hold your head up when it's on your, the more glorious the crown. But the crown James's hearers would have had in mind here, I don't think it was anything like that. It wasn't like, oh, there's the crown, and then there's the crown of life. The crown they're talking about here is more like a laurel wreath. It is the type of prize given as an award for for the completion of an athletic competition. It was a prize that was an award for successful endurance. And while at the end of a marathon, the reward might be a physical laurel crown, at the end of a life that has stood the test and remained steadfast under trial, he says, is the crown of life. The prize of eternal life. Eternity with God. Eternity without any tears or pain or loss anymore. Eternal life instead of death. As Brian talked about last week, the future completely changes the present. The promised prize at the end of life of a multicolored trials is this gift of eternal life. And it is rewarded to all the children of God, those who have accepted his love and forgiveness, those who have been transformed by his grace, those who have repented of their sin, and therefore those who, as a result, have remained steadfast under trial. Interestingly, this word here, and I kind of alluded to it at the beginning, but this word here, trial, is actually the noun version of the same verb we've been using for temptation. It's the same word, trial, temptation. It's actually the same word. He's saying one of the characteristics of God's children is that they remain steadfast under temptation. Now, of course, steadfastness here, it doesn't mean perfection. He's not saying they remain perfect under temptation and never fall into it. That's obviously not what he's saying, both in this context and in the context of the New Testament. He's not saying that you'll never fall into temptation, but he is saying that we, as his children, are continuing to grow in our ability to withstand temptation. And are growing in our steadfastness, growing in our ability to turn back to see and remember the ultimately beautiful one again and again and again. And the road back to him is getting, through our life, as we maintain that steadfastness, the road back to him is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter as we see the desires we have for the things in this world as the ultimately hopeless things they actually are. Which begs the question, okay, but where do we get this steadfastness from? Which brings us just a few verses back to the very beginning of this letter. Remember, he said, count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Every trial, every difficulty, every aspect of suffering in our lives, if you are one of his children, God is redeeming it and producing steadfastness through it. He is strengthening you so that you may be able to resist temptation. He is empowering you so that you may be able to endure temptation. He is enabling you so that you may be able to flee temptation. And if, again, for all these reasons, we can count it all joy then when we meet multicolored trials and the temptations that pour out of us even in the midst of them, because we know in all these ways and so much more, as God uses it and as God reveals the emptiness of it and reminds us of the glory and the beauty of his grace, we are again and again and again blessed. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let's thank him for that right now.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.